Our class, we appreciate your being here this morning. That's all right. Okay, we're in James chapter 1. We left off last time at verse 5. In that particular verse there, James is telling us about the need for wisdom and what we need to do. And he says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God. And what we've done, we've talked about the latter part of that, talking about, how God, answers our prayers and how He gives unto us. We talked about He gives, first of all, to all, and we talked about that last week. God gives to everybody. God does not show favoritism. If someone's lacking wisdom, He says, well, this is a Jewish Christian, I'll give it to him. The Gentile Christian, maybe not. No, God shows no favoritism. He gives to all. Any of His children who are asking Him for that wisdom, God will hear and God gives it to them. Now we're going to notice in just a moment there is a possibility, there is a one more thing that God says in regard to that. If you're going to receive that wisdom, what you have to do. But talking about how He gives to all people, and then the next part that we wanted to mention was, and why isn't this wanting to advance? Okay, need a little help. I can't get this to move forward. Jerry, can you get it to move forward? This isn't working. Get it to the first slide there. All right, now there we go. All right. He gives liberally to people. The Revised Standard Version, I know some of the other translations, says He gives generously. So God is not cheap in giving to His people what they need. He gives, and He gives in a generous way. He gives liberally to all people. But that word liberally, the one that's translated liberal here, it means more than just giving generously, giving a lot to what we need. It also means giving with the idea of expecting anything in return materially. Sometimes, maybe in our giving, people that need help, they may ask us for help. We may give to them generously, but sometimes we give with the expectation, of getting something back in return. Okay, I'm going to help this person. I choose to help them because I see where maybe in the future they might be able to help me. And they might be able to give to me, and so I'll do that. But God's not like that. God's giving to us and giving to us generally is not dependent upon whether or not He expects to get something back from you in return, that you're going to repay that in some way. So He gives generously. He's giving liberally to us. And then thirdly is the fact that it says that He gives without reproach. God doesn't upbraid when He gives to us. I was looking at one individual in writing about this, and he is from England, and he said, God gives without casting it into your teeth, or without casting back into your teeth. And I didn't know what in the world he was talking about. But I find out that literally the word that's used here, and He gives without reproach, carries that idea without casting it back at you. In other words, you ask God for something, and maybe, the next day you need to go and ask Him again. Well, sometimes if you do that with people, they'll say, man, I just gave that to you yesterday, and you're back begging for it again? And they're just casting that at you. Look what I did for you yesterday, and now you're back here again. And sometimes, people will do that to us, but He's telling us God's not like that. And I think one of the things He's trying to emphasize to us is that you shouldn't be afraid to go to God when you have a need. Because sometimes we're fearful that, hey, I'm constantly, it seems like I'm always asking God for help in this regard. I'm needing Him. And so I'm asking it again and again and again. And we're fearful that God's going to get tired of that, And or sometimes maybe, I've thought about this, maybe there's something that you have a need for and you want to talk to God about it and you're going to ask God for it. But maybe in your mind you get to think, well, this is not really that important. And what if tomorrow I have some greater need? And if I ask for this today and God gives it to me, and then tomorrow I've got a greater need and I've got to go ask for that, then maybe God is going to say, are you never satisfied? Are you always having to ask again? And so James is wanting to emphasize that God's not like that. And as a Christian, you never need to fear, I'm asking too much of God. I should never have to go back again and again and ask God's help in this. That's not the case. We need to do that. I thought about the time when Peter was questioning Jesus about forgiveness. And Peter, said to Jesus, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Till 7 times? I think about, in the minor prophets there of the time where God was talking about the different nations and He's bringing judgment upon them. And God would say something like, for 3 transgressions and for 4, I will not relent. The idea is God saying, I've forgiven you 3 times, but now the 4th time, no forgiveness here. I'm bringing judgment upon you. And so maybe Peter's thinking, look, I'm going to double what God said back then and add 1 to it. And so I'm going to be willing to forgive my brother 7 times when he sins against me. And is that good? And maybe he was expecting Jesus to commend him for that. But what did Jesus tell him? Yeah, you do it 70 times 7. And again, I don't think that's meant to be a literal number that Jesus just emphasized. Listen, as often as your brother, comes to you and asks for forgiveness, you need to be willing to forgive. Doesn't matter how many times it is. And that's because that's the way God is. God doesn't upbraid. You do something wrong and you pray to God and ask for His forgiveness, and then you turn right around and you do the same thing again. And it's not, that you're turning against God, but weakness you have in the flesh, and you make these mistakes over and over, and you think maybe I shouldn't ask God again. Maybe if I do, He's going to upbraid me for that. He's going to cast it back at me. But God's not like that. And so we never need to fear that we're asking too much of God. That is, it going back again and again. We need to be willing to ask. And so when God gives, He gives to all people. He gives generously, and He gives without upbraiding. And so that's the way God gives. And we'll say a little bit more about that later this morning. And so there's that. He gives without reproach. But, as I said, there is a condition attached to this promise. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously, liberally, without reproach, and it shall be given to him. There's the promise, it shall be given. But there's a condition attached to that. Because James says, let him ask in faith. Now, why is that necessary? If we want God to give us that wisdom we need, and He's promised He'll give it to us if we ask, but then there's this condition, you have to ask in faith. Why is that so important?
It's spiritual.
It's spiritual, but what does it mean to ask in faith? Sir? You're expecting it. You have that confidence in God that what He's promised He's able to give, and He will give. So you've got to have the faith in Him that He will do that. He'll provide that for you. Back in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6, that was the great faith chapter that we studied several weeks back now. But in Hebrews 11 and verse 6, what does God say about faith? Without faith, what? It's impossible to please God. For he that comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of them that diligently seek Him. And so, when I go to God in prayer to ask something of God, I've got to have that faith, that confidence that He is able and He will give it to me. And that's important to us. And that's the thing he emphasizes here about this, having that faith in God, that He's able to provide and desires to provide for us those things which we need. And then he says to ask or to be without faith is to show doubt in God. That we're not really confident that He can. We doubt either that He can or that He will give us that which we need. And again, I think about Matthew chapter 14, verse 29 and 30. This was an occasion when the disciples are in a ship and Jesus comes to them walking on the water, and they thought it was a ghost. And so they cried out in fear, and Jesus says, "Fear not, it is I." And Peter said what? Lord, if it's you, do what? Yeah, bid me to come to you on the water. And so Jesus said, come. And Peter stepped out of the boat and started walking on that water toward Jesus. And then what happened? He saw the boisterous wind and became fearful. And as a result, he began to sink. And immediately he cried out to Jesus, Lord, save me. And Jesus lifted him up. And Jesus said to him, O ye of little faith, wherefore did you doubt? He's got that confidence at one time to believe in God enough that when Jesus said come, that he'll get out of the boat and start walking. But then something happened that caused him to doubt when he saw the waves. Fearful, maybe, that Jesus is not going to allow him to do that. And that happens to us sometimes. And so if we don't have that full confidence and faith in Christ, that shows doubt on our part. And he makes the statement here that the doubting person should not think that he will receive anything from God. You've got to have that faith. You've got to believe he is, and he's a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. And if you don't have that faith, then you're doubting that God has the ability to do that. And that's exactly what he said. Now, look at here in James, as James continues talking about it, James calls that person a double-minded person. You know, what do you think that means to be double-minded? He says he is double-minded. He's a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. In what sense is he unstable?
That man, you got pleasing, putting God first on everything, some things, and then all of a sudden you put something else, a worldly thing in.
Yeah, it's your faith. Sir? Yeah, it wavers. The faith, you have that strong faith and confidence in him one moment, and the next moment you don't. You know, James goes on, he's going to talk about, he said it's like the waves of the sea. You've been to the ocean before, and you see those waves come rolling into the shore, and then what happens? They recede, they go back out again. And that's the way it is sometimes. That's the double-minded person. It's like a person that has two minds within him. And one mind is trusting in God, and the other mind is not trusting. And so there's the wavering. At one moment he believes what God says to act upon it, then the next moment he doesn't believe. William Barclay, and speaking about this, he said it's like a man that has these two different minds in him, and he's like a civil war going on between trusting in God and not trusting. And so that person, because he's double-minded, he has those doubts, James says he's not to expect that he'll receive anything from God. And so if you lack that wisdom, you need to ask God, but when you ask, you've got to do it asking in faith, believing that God can and will give that to you, and not allowing any doubts to come into your mind about that. You don't want to be the double-minded man. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24. Jesus talked about the fact that you cannot serve two masters. And so some have said, maybe that's the situation here with a double-minded person. He's trying to serve two masters, and you can't do that. He's trying to be loyal to two, and you can't do that. You've got to have that complete, full trust and confidence in Christ to do His will and to believe that He can provide for you those things that you need. And so then, if you lack faith, or lack wisdom, you need to ask, but you have to ask in faith. And then verse 9, he seems like he's going to something different, but really there's a reason behind this, what he's doing. Verses 9 and 10, he talks about instructions that he's being given here, both to the rich and the poor brother. And if we look at those verses 9 through 11, he says, let the lowly brother glory in his exaltation, but the rich in his humiliation, because as the flower of the field he will pass away. For no sooner has the sun risen with a burning heat than it withers the grass, its flower falls, and its beautiful appearance perishes. So the rich man also will fade away in his pursuits. So it begins there in verse 9. And he says, let the lowly brother glory in his exaltation. Why does it refer to this brother as a lowly brother? Like he's poor. And that's what he's talking about. And because he's poor, nobody really pays a lot of respect to him, They don't listen to what he has to say. They don't look to him as being someone that might have wisdom or anything. And so they don't really respect him. He's a lowly brother in that sense. And it's all because of the fact that he's poor. But he says then, let that lowly brother glory in his exaltation. And so this lowly brother that we're talking about here is really the poor brother. And so let the poor brother glory in his exaltation. And the idea seems to be, here's a brother who's poor, and suddenly he becomes rich, and he's to glory in that. He's to be an individual that's filled with great joy at that. Now, can you think of any reason why somebody that's poor and suddenly becomes rich, why they would be happy? I mean, it happens all the time. I watch it on TV, that Publishers Clearinghouse, and they come to the door and they've got this check, $5,000 a week for life, and when you die, we'll give it to somebody else that you want to name for life. And how do they react to that? Oh, no. No, they start screaming, they're so happy maybe, and sometimes they just become speechless. They don't know what to say. They're just overwhelmed with joy. And so when he says, let this brother rejoice in this, we think, well, sure, I can understand that. If suddenly he becomes rich, man, and in his mind, you got to think, well, away go all worries. Just last week I was thinking, how in the world am I going to pay the rent for this coming month? Or how am I going to pay for all the utilities I've got and the food that we need and clothing and so forth? And now suddenly I don't have to worry about that anymore because I've got all this money and I can buy whatever I want. And just that feeling that because of that, they have everything they need. And also now because I'm rich, I'm no longer the lowly brother. All of a sudden everybody looks up to me with respect because I've got money. And so they treat me differently than they did before. And so maybe he's going to rejoice because now that I've got this money, there's so much more I can do for the Lord. I'll be able to help send out missionaries. I'll be able to help those who are poor like I was and people were helping me out. Now I can help them out because I'm in this situation. But if you look again at the context, and Richard is right, and he's always eager to point out this, but it's right. The context helps us understand why the poor man is to exalt when he becomes rich. In the context, what is he talking about? You go back up to verse 2, where this section begins, and he says, my brethren, count it all joy. When? When you fall in various trials. So when these trials come to you in life, that's a reason to rejoice. Well, how in the world is getting wealthy a trial?
Because it brings you closer to God.
Well, it could, but that's not the trial that riches brings to you.
Oh, yeah.
It's not a trial to become closer to God. But riches really can have the opposite effect. Yeah. It can cause a person to fall away from God. That's the whole thing we're talking about here. Yes, sir.
I don't think he's talking about a poor man becoming rich. He's talking about a poor man. God's not a respecter of person, and he's entitled to the same kind of life as a rich man. I think that's the contrast.
Well, yeah, but it says, let him glory in his exaltation. He is being lifted up. And then in the context, the next time he's talking about a rich man. Right. It's all dealing Now with trials, the trials that you have in your life, for the poor man, if he becomes rich, there are certain trials now that he's going to encounter. And for the rich man who loses everything, and he's to glory in his humiliation, there are trials he comes from losing that wealth. And so I think that's the whole context here of what he's talking about. You know, how do you handle that? If you're poor and you suddenly become rich, there's a danger that's going to draw you away from God. And just over and over again, the Bible talks about this. Let me just read very briefly here a statement from Guy and Woods in regard to that. He said, "Many disciples who suffer great hardship and want endure much persecution and remain devoted to the Lord's will. But on becoming rich and prosperous, they find the temptation resulting from wealth so alluring and seductive that they surrender to Satan." That wealth can pull a person away from God. 3 John, verse 2. John is writing to his good friend Gaius. And he makes this statement to him. He says, "Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health, just as your soul prospers." What if John wrote a letter to you and he said to you, "I'm hoping you'll prosper in health, just like your soul prospers"? How would we be healthy physically? You know, I'm afraid sometimes if that prayer was offered up by John and answered by God, then John might get a reply. I said, "I hate to tell you, but he passed away 5 years ago." And see, his soul wasn't prospering. And so for his health to prosper as his soul prospering, it didn't prosper. And that's the thing that God's really concerned about, is how we are prospering spiritually. And riches can sometimes cause us not to prosper spiritually, but actually become poor spiritually. But if you're able to endure that, if you can suddenly become rich and it doesn't change you in your relationship to God and your service to God and your faithfulness to God, well, that's a reason to rejoice. Because that is evidence that your faith in God is genuine, it's real, and it's something that is steadfast. It's not going to pass away. It's not going to end. You've got that. And there's always going to be that danger that when you become rich, that you might be tempted to fall away from God. And we're going to say a little bit more about that in a minute. But now he says the rich brother is to glory in his humiliation. If that rich brother suddenly loses all of his wealth, he's to glory. Now, here's a question. We don't have any problem understanding how a poor man who suddenly becomes rich, why he can be filled with joy. But we're talking about a rich man who suddenly becomes poor. He loses everything that he has. How can he be joyous? Generally, when something like that happens, what's the reaction a person has? If he's rich and suddenly he loses every bit of it, how does he react? There are several ways things that can happen to him on the negative side. One may that he becomes angry and he blames God for it. You know, that you've taken all this from me. I mean, you know, how can you be happy when you've lost all that wealth and that lifestyle that you've grown used to that was good is now gone? And so, you know, that would happen. Or it may be that a person, when they lose that wealth, becomes despondent. And because of that, life is no longer worth living, and they take their own life. And we've talked about this before, you know, when the Great Depression hit back in 1929, and millionaires one day suddenly lost their wealth, and there were a number of them who jumped to their deaths because they couldn't bear living without that wealth they once had. That can happen to a person. But James says, if you're rich and you suddenly lose all of that, you need to glory in that. You need to rejoice in that. Well, why? Well, for one thing, if you think about that, if you're rich, a lot of times you find yourself worrying about those riches. You know, there are people constantly, you know, wanting what I've got, and I'm fearful of their stealing what I've got, or maybe they're constantly asking me for things, and if I don't give it to them, then they're going to hate me, you know, and I'm going to be rejected by them because of maybe even my own family members, you know. If I don't share my wealth with them and give them what they're asking for, you know, then they're going to hate me. Or it may be that somebody wants my wealth and I won't give it to them, so maybe they do something like kidnapping my child and say, if you ever want to see this child again, you've got to give me a certain amount of money. And that causes worries and fears because of that, because of the riches you've got, the way people do that. But if you lose all of those, guess what? You don't have to worry about that anymore. I used to think when I was growing when I grew up, when I was a kid, and I'd hear these stories about kidnapping, I was always terrified of that. What if somebody kidnaps me? And my older sister laughed at me. She said they kidnap kids because they're looking to get money. They're not going to get a thing from us. You know, we didn't have any money. We were poor as could be, and so we didn't have to worry about that. And so after that, I never thought anything more about it. You know, but that's one reason why a rich brother might realize, hey, I can rejoice because I don't have those problems and those struggles anymore in my life. But a second possibility why he might be able to rich is because he's no longer associating with worldly people. Now, yes, ma'am. Is it only what? Yes. Now, let me say this, and here's why. When he began talking about these trials back there in verse 2, he said, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. So generic. There's all kinds of trials that can come to you in life. And so he's just talking about trials in general. But now he begins talking about a specific trial that can come to you. And that is in regard to wealth. A poor man suddenly becomes wealthy. A wealthy man suddenly becomes poor. And how do you react to it? And if you react in the proper way, it gives you a reason to be joyous. But if you don't react in the right way, then, you know, that means the loss of your faith and the loss of that relationship that you have with God. And so if you are rich and you suddenly lose that, then for the most part you're not going to be associating with worldly people. Not everybody that's rich is worldly. There's nothing wrong in being rich. But a lot of times people who are rich are worldly. They only think about material things, what that money can buy for them. And they don't like to talk about that, about what they have. I told you about when I preached in Atlanta and taught in the school of preaching there. There were two men in our congregation who were millionaires. And one of them wanted to hire me to do some work for him. And I forgot what it was he was going to pay me. It was a piddling amount. But he told me, he said, your time's not as valuable as mine. He said, I know what you're making, and I know what I make. And so, you know, there are a lot of people like that. They are worldly minded. And they think their money is everything. And they like to brag about their money and what they can do with it and what they can buy. And so if you suddenly lose that, you're not going to be associated with those people anymore. And so that could be a reason for rejoicing. Thirdly, you're no longer be burdened with the responsibilities that come with those riches. I mean, if you're rich, you own some company that you're over, now all of a sudden you've got to be concerned about that every day. What needs to be done? What plans need to be made for the future? How are we going to invest what we've got? What are we going to try? You got all those worries that are constantly. But if you lose all that, yeah, those worries are gone. You don't have to worry about that anymore. Then also, finally, the fourth thing is, you might think, hey, now that I've lost all of that money, I've got more time to spend on spiritual things instead of material things. That might be a reason for doing it. But, you know, it's just the realization, though, that if you can go from poor to being rich and it doesn't change your relationship to God, and if you can go from rich to being poor and it doesn't change your relationship to God, your faithfulness, your steadfastness and service to Him, then that's a reason to rejoice, to be happy about that. But You know, you hear this idea sometimes, you know, moderation in all things. And sometimes in regard to wealth, moderation can be the best thing. And there's so many passages in the Bible that talk about this and the dangers that wealth brings to us. Proverbs 30, verses 7 through 9. Agur says, 2 things I request of you. Deprive me not before I die. Remove falsehood and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food allotted to me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. You know, wealth or poverty, either one can be a dangerous time in life to lead you away from God. And there's so many passages that talk about this. Deuteronomy 32 and verse 15. He talks about Jeshurun. That's talking about the nation of Israel. That's just another name for Israel. He says, but Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. You grew fat, you grew thick, you are obese. Then he forsook God who made him and scornfully esteemed the rock of his salvation. This idea of growing fat, the idea is simply the fact that he has benefited in life. He's become rich. He's fat, he's obese because now he can eat all these luxurious foods and so forth. That's the idea. He's benefited from that. But in growing rich, he's turned against God. Now, the warning had come earlier in Deuteronomy to the Israelite people that there was a danger that something like that could happen. Deuteronomy 8, 11 through 16. He says, beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, and his statutes, which I command you today. Lest when you have eaten and are full and have built beautiful houses and dwell in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiplied, and your silver and your gold are multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, when your heart is lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. Now he continues on with that, and he says, who led you through that great and terrible wilderness, in which were fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty land, where there was no water, who brought water for you out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers did not know, that he might humble you, and that he might test you, to do you good in the end. God warning them. Here in the wilderness, well, when you were in Egypt, it was hard. You had no rest. You did not have the things you needed. You were a slave there, and God brought you out of that. But when you rebelled against God and going into the land to take it because of the fear that there were giants there and you couldn't defeat them, because of that, you had to stay in the wilderness. And that wasn't good. There was no water there. There was not ample food for you there. There were fiery serpents there that I think were responsible for killing something like 23,000 of the Jews. And yet God brought you through all of that. He was there with you, and now He's brought you into this land. And when you come into that land, and all of a sudden things change, and you're going to be able to live in these houses that are beautiful. And you're going to have all this food that you could ever want. And your herds are going to multiply. You'll have more and more cattle and sheep. And your gold and your silver is going to multiply. You're going to become extremely rich. And as a result, you forget the Lord your God. And God has done all of this. It says that He might test you. Here's a trial that God's put upon you to see how you're going to react when suddenly you become rich. And Israel failed the test because when they grew rich, they did forget about God. And so there's a danger that I know most people long to be rich. We desire that. We long for that. And don't realize the trials that they can bring to you in life. But it can do that to you. Well, there's so many other passages. In the New Testament, the disciples were astonished at His words, but Jesus answered and said to them, children, how hard it is for those who trust in riches to enter the kingdom of God. The riches makes it difficult for them to be willing to accept the will of God and to obey Him. Luke, that's supposed to be verse 20 and verse 15, and He said to them, take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things that he possesses. And sometimes we can think, boy, if I had all these things, what a difference it would make, and everything would be right with me in life, and I could truly be joyous. But the reality is that real wealth does not consist of those things you possess. Real wealth are those things which are eternal. Real wealth is having a home with God eternally in the heavens. And those are the things that can bring true joy. So if you can go from poverty of riches and you keep your relationship with God, you're still faithful to Him, you're still steadfast in your service, then you know that you have the real wealth waiting you. Or the other way, if you're the rich man and suddenly find yourself in poverty, and yet it doesn't change your relationship to God, you're still faithful to Him. You're still doing. You look at Job and how he did when he went from riches to poverty. Everything that he owned physically is lost, and he kept the same attitude. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So he was still faithful in his service to God. And I believe that that's what he's dealing with here. Here is a particular trial that can come to people in life. And many people that can sustain some things simply are not able to sustain their faithfulness and trust to God when there are changes in regard to their monetary wealth. Whether it's gaining it or losing it. It can cause people too many times to change. But then James reminds us of this fact, that just as riches can be taken from us quickly, so also can our lives be taken quickly. The very next passage there, James 1 and verse 11, for no sooner has the sun risen with a burning heat, that it withers the grass, its flower falls, and its beautiful appearance perishes. So the rich man also will fade away in his pursuits. He's using an analogy that the people of Israel would know well. They'd know about what's called here the burning heat. Literally, the word in the Greek that's translated here as burning heat is one that simply means a hot wind. The hot winds that comes from the deserts that lie to the east of Palestine. That when the sun rises up and it builds up that heat, and that hot wind comes in off of that desert. I have read where it is said that vegetation can be destroyed within an hour by that hot heat that comes in. And so very quickly, something that's as beautiful as that grass or the flowers that grow there can quickly be destroyed. Just in a matter of a few hours, all of it can be gone. And the warning that James is giving here is, listen, it's the same way with us. Our life can be taken from us quickly. Even the rich man's life can be taken quickly. Normally, when we think about the rich man and some of the advantages the rich man has is, he's probably going to live longer than us because he's going to always have the food that he needs. He's going to have that he needs. And, he might get sick. Yeah, he might. But with his money, he can get the best doctors available. And he can go to the hospital when he needs to. He doesn't have to worry about that. And so generally speaking, he's going to live longer. But James is telling that rich man, just like anybody else, can die quickly. He can die just as quickly as the grass that's destroyed by that burning heat, that hot wind that comes into Palestine. And so with that as a realization that life can be taken with you so quickly, and that man himself can fade away in the pursuit that he's involved in. His working more and more to gain more wealth or whatever it is, in the very midst of that, his life can be taken from him. And so if you realize that, there's a realization that can come so quickly, that what we need to be really concerned about is not about our wealth or our poverty, but our relationship to God, and whether or not we're living for Him as we should. Now, our time's gone, but next week we're going to keep on with this. In verse 12, he's going to talk about that crown of life. And that's what's important. Right. And that crown of life, and whether or not we're going to receive that crown of life, not based upon whether you're rich or whether you're poor. Boy, I'm poor, so God's going to take care of me and He'll give me that. No, it's based upon something else. So, Lord willing, we'll talk about that next week. We've got about 20 minutes then before our 10:30 worship hour begins.